Good evening. Welcome, everyone. I'm Allison McFarlane. I'm the director of the School of Public Policy and Global Affairs here at the University of British Columbia. And it's my great pleasure to welcome you all. We have a full house here tonight to the second event of the 2025 Phil Lind Initiative Speaker Series. Before we begin, though, I want to acknowledge that we're gathered here today on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded lands of the Musqueam peoples. For countless generations, these lands have been a place of learning, connection, and stewardship. We're deeply grateful for the opportunity to come together here and continue the tradition of sharing knowledge and ideas. And I also want to express our gratitude to the Chance Center, thank you guys, for partnering with us and providing this beautiful venue for our series. And I also want to take a moment to express our profound gratitude to the late Phil Lind, whose vision and generosity made this initiative possible. And to his family for their continued support in honoring Phil's legacy. Tonight, we're honored to have members of Phil's family and close friends in attendance. Really, we thank you for being here with us, and thank you, Phil, for making this possible. So this year's theme of the Lind Initiative explores what it means to be American, navigating identity in a changing nation. And boy, does it seem to be changing. Given the rapidly shifting political landscape south of the border, this conversation has never felt more urgent. In the past, I've emphasized the links between American politics and events here in Canada to underscore the importance of these conversations. But writing these remarks against the backdrop of an American president who openly muses about annexing Canada as the 51st state, yeah, boo, lends a new and unsettling weight to our conversation tonight. Before we go any further, though, let me give you a few logistical notes. We will be taking audience questions in the latter portion of the event through Slido. Simply go to slido.com, there it is, and enter the event code, #Lind25, and that will allow you to ask questions, upvote questions, etc. And a friendly reminder to silence your phones as well. So now it's my pleasure to introduce our moderator for the evening, Peter Klein. Peter's an award-winning journalist, documentary filmmaker, founder of the Global Reporting Center, and professor here at the UBC School of Journalism, Writing, and Media. Peter is a longtime producer with CBS News 60 Minutes, and he's produced projects for many major American news programs, including Frontline, Nightline, and 2020. He's also written for the New York Times, the Christian Science Monitor, and many other newspapers, and his work has been honored by the National Academy of Television Arts and Sciences, the Society of Professional Journalists, among others. I'm now finally pleased to introduce our keynote speaker, the Honorable Adam Kinzinger. Adam is a Let me give him a little intro. Adam is a former six-term U.S. congressman. He served from 2011 to 2023. He's a U.S. Air Force officer and a distinguished voice on American politics. While in the House of Representatives, he served as a member of the House Committee on Energy and Commerce and the House Foreign Affairs Committee, where he was ranking member of the Subcommittee on Europe. He was one of only 2 GOP members to serve on the Select Committee investigating the January 6 attacks on the U.S. Capitol. And one of 10 Republicans who voted to impeach President Donald Trump. Yeah, no love for Trump here, I guess. Late last year, a documentary following his efforts to hold Trump accountable, The Last Republican, premiered at TIFF to critical acclaim. Since leaving Congress, he's continued this work through his organization, Country First, and as a political analyst and commentator. And we are really thrilled to have him here with us tonight to share his insights. So please join me in welcoming Adam Kinzinger.
Thank you. So I'll ask you a few questions, and then we'll turn to the audience, who, as you know, you can put your questions on Slido. I'll start with a question probably a lot of people in the room are wondering. If we do become a 51st state, will you be our governor?
Yes! What are the citizenship rules? Do you have to be born here to be like governor or anything?
Well, once you're American. No, seriously, would you consider a run in 2028? And equally importantly, could someone like you, who is obviously very charismatic, has great leadership skills, and appeals to a broad spectrum on the political spectrum, could someone like that become president in 2029?
I think so. And look, let me say thank you for those kind words about that. And honestly, and I hope you know this, like, I only want to do this because I actually believe in this stuff. Like, I would love to walk away. I really would. But I think the fight's too important. And that's why I'm staying engaged. So somebody like me, look, where am I at? First off, I literally have no plans to run again for office, but I also would never rule out, potentially in 4 years running for the big job, only because I think it is important to have that forum to be able to say the kind of things that I think need to be said, right? Which is, your country's actually pretty good, guys, and your other Americans aren't the enemy. And do I think there's room for a message like that? Yes, because I think there is no way, and I really believe this, and by the way, I also didn't think Trump would get reelected, so just take that for what it's worth. But I don't think there's any way this populist, nationalistic movement, they never last. I don't think it lasts past this 4 years. And in fact, the interesting thing, I remember speaking, when I spoke to the Democratic National Convention, feeling that like Kamala Harris is kind of riding this. It feels like she's riding some momentum here. America wants to heal the system. It was, when Trump won in 2016, there was an invisible movement that we didn't see until it was passed, which is like people want to break the system. I think, unfortunately, it wasn't time quite yet, but I think there's this underpinning movement of America wanting to fix and heal the system and wanting to actually see their fellow Americans not as the enemy anymore. So yes, I do think there's room. Whether it's me or somebody else, I don't know. I just want whoever could be successful to do that.
Well, so let me just play devil's advocate. Let's say 4 years from now, let's say you're right, that Trumpism is over and the whole country wakes up and says, what the heck were we doing?
The whole country won't, but 51% maybe.
Enough, right.
Yeah.
But we have people in leadership now who want to essentially dismantle the government and who are actively, you say it's 3 weeks. I mean, they want to get rid of the Department of Energy, they want to get rid of the Department of Education, they want to get rid of all sorts of cabinet level positions and cut back, getting rid of USAID, et cetera. If you become president 4 years from now, what do you inherit? What are you going to be running? What would anybody be running at that point if they're successful in 4 years in genuinely transforming the government?
You inherit, like today, there was news that they basically, the federal government's laid off everybody on probationary status, which, by the way, is the next generation of government workers. Right. So basically, the young generation was laid off today. What do you inherit? I think you inherit a mess, but you inherit the ability to fix things the right way, potentially. Look, I mean, if they get rid of the Department of Education and education gets way better for it, I'll admit then that was a good thing. I don't think that's going to happen, okay? And America is going to feel that. You want to get rid of the DOE, and all of a sudden you realize there's certain energy policy you don't have control over, or each state has different rules on nukes that is going to create a different. you get rid of this stuff, which sounds great on paper, and then you touch the stove, right? I told you about my 3-year-old. Thankfully, he doesn't want to, but if he wanted to touch the stove, I could stop him, but eventually he's going to do it when I'm not looking. I feel like we're at that moment in America where some of this pain, as much as I don't want it to happen, may be necessary. So people say, okay, all this talk about we need to do this and this and this has real life consequences. This is what those consequences are, and we don't want to do that.
On this campus, and I think on a lot of campuses, we're really big on transparency and positionality. So I'll give you the 10 seconds of my positionality. I'm American. Your grandfather fought to free my father, who was a Holocaust survivor, and then was a refugee to the United States. Listened to Radio Free Europe, Radio Free Liberty, had this notion of America being paved in gold, worked it on the assembly line at Ford his entire life in Sharonville, Ohio. When my brother bought a Toyota, my brother was disowned. And that's the America I was raised with. This notion that it is a country that welcomes people, that has historically welcomed people, obviously not at the beginning time. It was a rough start at the beginning, but developed this reputation of welcoming people and being a refuge. We've seen a backslide from that. You've spent time recently on the border, the U.S.-Mexico border. What do you think about the nativist approach of this administration, and frankly, a lot of people in America who don't even agree with this administration, potentially? What do you think's going on there on the Mexico border and the whole notion of protecting America and expelling people who are not considered quote-unquote American?
Look, I think there's two things to it. So first off, there are people that use the immigration thing as a substitute for just racism, right? I mean, let's be honest. If this was a bunch of people from Ireland coming, I don't know if they'd be as upset, right? Or Norway. What is it? Trump had said his first presidency, he's like, why don't we have more people from Sweden coming or whatever? Really? Why would that be? But, so I do think there is a number of people on that it is a substitute for racism. Same with when you say DEI, right? That's a substitute for racism. There are also people that have a true concern with what's happening on the border. Here's my concern on the border my concern is less about, we don't want people from Mexico or Latin America. My wife's Salvadorian. When I worked the border, I saw a lot of human trafficking. I saw a lot of dead bodies. I flew, military planes there against the cartel, and you see like the cartel truck people into Arizona, and then they'll leave them out in the desert and they die of thirst. I mean, you'll find dozens of these bodies a week. So we need control of the southern border. But the thing is, there's like a way you can talk about that that's not racist. That also says, which is what I've always said, which is like, let's liberalize, small l, the immigration system into the United States so people can come legally while controlling the illegal immigration. And by the way, the 15 million people in the United States illegally, we're not going to deport them all. Sorry, Trump, it's not going to happen. I'd much rather those folks than be given legal status so they can work in our economy. Anybody in here in business understands if you have an asset that's sitting in the corner, you're losing money. I hate to see people as this way, but I'd like to have these assets working and building into the economy. Plus, in the U.S., I think 2/3 of every new business start is an immigrant, a first-generation immigrant. 80% of Americans, by the way, agree with what I just said. The problem is there is a disadvantage for somebody like Trump to say the same thing. He's instead going to use people's fear. And so, look, I think we're in a nativist moment. My hope is this doesn't last, but I do think, and I wish the Biden administration and prior administrations would have gotten a hold of it, I do think we have to get a hold of the southern border. You're never going to shut it down, but make sure that we fix our system down there.
I think it was the year you joined Congress, 2011, Evan Bayh, a moderate Democrat from Indiana, from a very famous family, Birch Bayh was his father, left the Senate, frustrated with the partisanship, and that was a long time ago. even then, there were problems with partisanship and this pressure to conform along party lines. And if you look at the votes, I mean, frankly, I don't know what the heck you guys do in Congress, because you basically just mostly just do what your whip tells you to do.
Yeah.
So, like, what's the point of having an independent mind and understanding the issues? So, can you talk about that pressure? We just saw Tom Tillis, Senator Tillis was working his little butt off trying to get Hegseth, off just quietly, so he wouldn't, Hegseth wouldn't be the Secretary of Defense, so they wouldn't have to vote against it and suffer the consequences. And that failed, and then he voted for it. He was pressured, even though everybody knew he was against it. Can you talk about that pressure?
Yeah.
I mean, it feels a little bit like peer pressure in high school, on Capitol Hill. Like, what is it like?
Well, let me say this. So Tom Tillis, who is my personal, I hate him right now because of this. So remember with Hegseth, it was Collins, Murkowski, and McConnell voted against Hegseth. Well, they had actually believed that Tom Tillis was also going to vote against him, because they all made a pact that the four of them would vote against him. And in the last second, Tom Tillis changed because he didn't want that pressure. Look, I wrote on my Substack, follow me on Substack if you don't, by the way, if you like this stuff. Anyway, I wrote on my Substack, I woke up at 3 a.m. two mornings ago, just angry, because I'm these senators, many of who aren't even up for 4 years for election, don't have the courage to do the right thing. And by the way, people like Bill Cassidy, who voted to remove Trump, but now he's in an election window. He knows RFK Jr. was terrible, voted for him anyway, because he didn't want the pressure. It's actually, I think the House is more courageous than these senators right now, because they're at least in an election window every 2 years. What's the pressure like? When I was there, the pressure wasn't that bad. In all honesty, there would be some important things that would come up that you would get a lot of pressure on. So, for instance, we want to pass a continuing resolution to keep the government open or whatever. Yes, there would be a lot of pressure, and I was always a team player anyway, because I'm not a shut it down type. And but that you would get it on that. But generally, on other bills or on whatever it is that you're passionate about, you had a lot of flexibility to kind of do whatever you want. You don't always have to vote with the party. Different now. Because anybody that had an independent view from Trump either has been kicked out of the party or they've learned that they have to conform. And you don't conform 90%, it's 100%. This is a cult. It's 100%. Mike Pence, who did so much, carried so much water for Donald Trump, committed one sin, which is he didn't overthrow an election for him, and he's more hated than they hate me. And that's all he did. So what's that message to people? You're in line 100% of the time, because if you come out of line even once, you're done. So they won't vote against any cabinet member, and that's frightening. That's how a cult works, by the way, right? You can't go against the cult leader. You're scared to go against the cult leader. If you do, you're going to be excommunicated. But if you have a change of heart, they'll welcome you back. By the way, if I got on TV tomorrow and said, I actually was wrong, I love Donald Trump, he's my best friend, I would be in Mar-a-Lago in 2 days. He's quick to forgive, but that's the superpower. So the pressure now, if you think the pressure was bad when I was there, now you literally can't be independent. Why anybody would want to stay in this job, honestly, I don't know.
We've seen this decline in, let's just call it the intellectual scaffolding of the Republican Party.
That's a good way to put it. Yeah.
But, I'll ask you a tough question. I worked at 60 Minutes for many years, so I have to. Sarah Palin endorsed you. Mm-hmm. You accepted her endorsement. I sort of see her as kind of the beginning of that.
I do too.
I read every paper, and I could see Russia. There was kind of this lightweight election, not to be cruel about it, but there was sort of a simplicity to her approach to politics. And it just seems to have gone down and down and down. What do you think is, because there are a lot of really, really smart Republicans, and you know them and I know them, what is it that has driven that, both within the party and to some extent the appeal from the public, that they want that?
It's a great question, and this is a lesson for Canadian conservatives too, okay? So it's funny, I can look back. It's part of the reason I actually wrote a book. I didn't want to, but I was like, if I tell my story from coming into politics to exit, it kind of tells the broader story of the GOP, right? There was this kind of populist bent with Tea Party, but then after we won the majority, the Tea Party went from like 10,000 people showing up to rallies to 200, so you ended up with this kind of hardcore crazies that ended up metastasizing into more. And so I can look back and be like, yeah, I contributed a little bit to this here. I should have seen this. We thought we had beaten back the crazies in 2014, and then Trump comes along. And so it's a great lesson. But here's the thing I learned from that. And this is the lesson for conservatives in the UK, Canada, and Australia, because typically we all kind of go along the same track, which is if you have cancer in your body, get rid of it. Okay? We had this extremist movement, and there was this belief. I always fought against them, I will honestly say. But leadership always thought if we just bring the Louis Gohmerts or whatever into the tent, yes, they're going to be crazy, but we can get their vote, we can control them. Well, that doesn't work. Because if you ever, a Lincoln Day dinner is like these Republican, fundraisers in every county that you have. And I always said you'd go to a Lincoln Day dinner and there's like one table of weirdos that was there that like have their whatever weird conspiracy theory. Come back next year, everybody believes that. And the table of weirdos has another extreme conspiracy theory. So what I'm saying is, cancer infects the body. And that's the lesson to Canadian conservatives, the lesson I learned, which is you do not make a deal with cancer. Because if you take a tumor and you put it in your body thinking the good cells will overwhelm it, it never works that way. And that's what I learned, is you cannot make room for authoritarians, for Christian nationalism, or whatever in the GOP, because it won. It took us over and won.
Kash Patel is our oncologist now, basically. I have a bunch more questions, but there's a really good one here I want to ask you. What move by Trump do you think will be the straw that breaks the camel's back and results in any Republican standing up to him in any meaningful way?
I'm sorry, none. Honestly, I don't think... Now, here's the good thing, is that 51%, in theory, still controls democracy, and that's still in the United States. And obviously, electoral college, all that stuff, but whatever. Still, basically, the majority rules. And not every Republican buys into what Donald Trump is doing. That's the good thing. You can minimize that eventually. But I don't know. Is there a red line? I'm sure there is somewhere that like Republicans wouldn't go beyond. But I got to tell you, we've approached 6 or 7 of them that I thought were red lines that weren't.
No, when he said the John McCain thing, I told my wife, he's over.
He's done. Toast. Yep. No, and he just got more popular. January 6th, for God's sakes, right? So I'm sitting there on January 6th, and like for 3 weeks after that, it's crickets in the room with all the Republican congressmen, because we're all like, I was actually trying to overthrow McCarthy at that point. Nobody jumped in, whole other story. But like 3 weeks later, Kevin McCarthy goes to Mar-a-Lago and literally revives Donald Trump's career. But yeah, and that wasn't a red line for him, and he was supposedly a moderate. I don't think there is a point, honestly, that Republicans, short of him coming out and saying he loves Satan, or something like that. Yeah, I don't know if that exists. He's getting ready to sell Ukraine out. And I'm seeing these senators that are saying on the record, I was reading it just before I came out here, that are like, well, we're going to give him a chance to cut a deal. I don't like this, but he's a deal maker. Like, fuck. I almost said a bad word, but I didn't say it.
Let's shift gears for a moment. In your farewell address in Congress, you obviously called out the Republicans, but you also called out the Democrats. And what responsibility do the Democrats have? Biden said he was going to be a one-term president. Yeah. He went back on that. And then at sort of very last minute switched candidates, which obviously was very difficult for Vice President Harris, who you endorsed. But what responsibility do Democrats have for, by some people's measures, not giving a strong enough alternative to Donald Trump?
Look, I'll say this. There's some responsibility, but I don't want that to be taken as it's the Democrats' fault where we are. It's not. But as an opposition party, or a party that's fighting for survival or for power, you have a responsibility to try to reach 51% of people. Where the Democrats have really been hit lately is they have lost middle class, and they've lost like kind of the Midwest, that group of people. Labor, they've lost labor. I've said, like, I think if you were an economic voter 20 years ago for the Democrats, like you were voting because of their economics, I think you're now a Republican voter. If you were a Republican voter 20 years ago, you're now a Democratic voter. If you voted on social issues, you're still the same. But if it was economics, it's switched. College-educated people used to all vote Republican. Now they're voting Democrat. So what's the responsibility? Look, yes, Biden should not have run again, and he should have allowed an open primary process. We could have gotten the best candidate, and if that candidate was Harris, she would have been able to actually explain what she believes longer than 150 days, because she could not run away from some of her pretty far left stuff she did that the country just didn't want. She didn't have a chance to get away. But the other thing is, right now, I've been pretty harsh on the Democrats this last couple of weeks because they've known for 3 months that Donald Trump was going to be president, and they act like they have no clue what to do right now. Like, they should have spent 3 months coming up with a plan. Because none of this is surprising. I mean, I guess we didn't fully expect he was going to do all this, but he said he was going to do this. They should have had a plan, and they didn't. They caught flat-footed. Now they're starting to get that together, and we'll forget that they never had a plan once we're full in. But I do think they bear some responsibility on that. When you're in the minority, you only have one weapon, at least in the House, is messaging. That's your only weapon, because you now have to lay out an alternative case so that you win the election in 2 years, and that's what the Democrats can do. What'll be interesting is, do the Democrats give Republicans votes on things like keeping the government open? If they do that, they will bear a lot more responsibility, I think.
We've all watched, I think, with a little confusion on what's going on with Elon Musk. We saw him at the Oval Office the other day with his kid on his neck. And what's going on there? I can't articulate the question any better than that. What the heck is going on?
By the way, did you guys see his kid telling Trump to shush his mouth? That was awesome. Look, here's what's going on. So the tech bros have been married to the Republican Party now. Why? I don't fully know. Now, give me 30 seconds to tell why I think the Republicans are winning men, and I think this has some bearing on this. So for the last 15 years, there was this thing going out that masculinity was toxic. People would say toxic masculinity. And so in the absence of men really giving a version of what good masculinity is, which is, by the way, fighting against injustice, punching up, not punching down, defending your family, providing, that's all good, healthy masculinity. Instead, these young men basically felt like they had no home, like they weren't important, they didn't belong, and Donald Trump comes along, who actually has real toxic masculinity, but in the absence of anybody defending or defining it, they look at that and go, he makes me feel like I belong, and young men zoop over to Donald Trump, and that's why he's winning them so aggressively. So it's on, yes, Democrats, but it's mainly on men to provide now an example of what healthy masculinity is. We're not ashamed of it, and we shouldn't be ashamed of it, but we should be healthy. And I think the tech bro and Elon Musk thing has a little bit to go with that. Elon, with some of the transgender issues, I think that had a hit with him because he's got a kid that's transgender. And I also think, there was some bearing on COVID. We were talking earlier. But I also think, look, Elon Musk is deep in the ketamine and it's done something to his brain. And look, when you have money, you go after power. When you have power, you go after money. What does Elon Musk have? Money. What is he trying to get now? Power. It's a story as old as time, and I think that's a lot of it. And unfortunately, there's no backstop that is kicking him out now. The courts have been sort of kicking back, but they're a little slow. And what I really worry about is the day that Donald Trump says we're not going to follow this court decision. At that point, I think the only thing is to take to the streets because there's no backup to that.
I want to ask you about the courts, and there's a good question along those lines, but there's another good question along those lines that's a follow-up to what you said, which is, we've seen lots of countries around the world over time essentially ruled by oligarchies. We have the richest person in the world right now, jokingly, but not jokingly, essentially being treated as the president, essentially the shadow president. And a lot of those tech bros, as you called them, falling in line, who are Democratic supporters and everything, Gulf of America. That's what it says on Google now, right? In parentheses, but nevertheless, it's there. So is the U.S. descending into an oligarchy? Was it already an oligarchy? We've seen huge, distance between the richest and the poorest over both of our lifetimes.
I don't know if we were. I think we are now. We're getting there. And I always had said prior to any of this Elon Musk stuff, I'm concerned about the role of money in politics and that this could lead to an oligarchy. The founding fathers never intended for one person to be able to put $300 million in an election. I promise you that, because their thing was everybody should have equal access to the government, right? Everybody should have, we were explicitly throwing off the idea that there's a special governing class. Anybody can govern. And they never intended that. And, unfortunately with Citizens United and some of those decisions, it's what we're left with. But now, the thing that concerns me, if you look at Vladimir Putin, initially he started to kind of win over the oligarchs. They had a little agreement. Then he ends up putting fear of God in the oligarchs. And our hope now is that the oligarchs get upset, that they find their courage to rise against him. But it's pretty close to what we have here. Elon Musk comes in. How many people are we seeing already obey in advance? They're talking about Paramount potentially settling with Donald Trump. I think it was over 60 Minutes because he sued him for $10 gajillion, which is a joke. But there's concern that they'll settle simply because there's a merger coming up. Look at what happened with ABC settling with Donald Trump over Stephanopoulos. And you start to see this obey in advance, and it becomes a real concern. And people like Elon Musk and the Facebook guy and all those dorks, all of a sudden now kind of feeding each other. And how do you compete against that? I don't know. I really don't.
You referenced earlier that there was a time not that long ago that educated people were voting Republican, less educated people were voting Democrats. The Democrats, the Dixiecrats, were behind a lot of the civil rights, the wrongs in the South in the 50s and 60s. Politics changes, it evolves. Is there a scenario in which a saner Republican Party or something, non-Trump party, whatever you call it, emerges out of this? Or is there a scenario in which a third party could emerge? There have been third parties in the past. There are countries like Canada that are successful outside of a two-party system. Obviously, it's a parliamentary system, it's different. But can we get to a position where there is a party that essentially would have you and your ethos as its core?
Look, yes. I'll say this on the third-party stuff first, which is I used to make fun of parliamentary systems because they're confusing, but you guys actually are doing it right. Now that I see it, I'm like, kind of makes sense, because you can have crazy parties and they don't end up getting into parliament, but people have an outlet and all that kind of stuff and try to make, alliances. And, for a while the two-party system worked, partially because the party structure actually had all the money. And so they were able to really discipline people that went too far out of this kind of center-right, center-left version. Well, with the money and the change in the money and the oligarchy came parties have less power, and now extremists can come up and raise a gajillion dollars too. So third party is difficult mainly because, first off, the barriers to get on the ballot are actually pretty hard. I won't bore you on that, but there's different requirements. But secondarily, we have been programmed to believe that there are two sides to every issue. Okay? Gun control, you're either for it or against it. Nope, actually it's not true. There's 20 different positions on guns. Abortion, you're either for or against it. Nope, actually there's about 50 different positions on abortion. Taxation, you want to raise them or lower them. there's different, so it's actually very nuanced differences, but the problem is we've been plugged into the matrix to believe that if you're pro-choice, you have to vote Democratic. If you're pro-life, you have to vote Republican. There's no spectrum. And so if a third party comes along, and let's say somebody's running as a centrist, and they say, well, I'm pro-choice. Well, the pro-lifers that might have been centrist are like, oh my God, I got to default back to the Republican Party. So I think we have to begin to reprogram people to think more nuanced than just everything has two issues. Can the Republican Party be saved? In the near term, no. In the long term, yes. I think every party has to have a healthy conservative movement. Right now, there is literally no conservative party, because, by the way, the Republican Party is not conservative. I want to be very clear. They call themselves conservative, but they are not conservative. And so I think there's a point where that could come back. The biggest question now is, and this is what I talk about a lot, I'm going to use a military analogy. If you think about Ukraine, if you go into a trench in Ukraine, there was an old joke. It's like if you put two Ukrainians in a room, they'll create three political parties, right? So it's a country that's very divided politically. But now if you jump into a foxhole in Ukraine, you'll meet people. One guy may be a college professor. Another one may have been a machinist, somebody that played the piano, and somebody over here, whatever. They probably all vote differently, but they're all committed to defending their democracy. So I always think about if you're in a trench and you have an enemy 5 meters away and one 25 meters away, I'm telling all the men and women in the trench with me, we focus only on that 5 meter. That's it. The 25 meter thing doesn't exist until we take care of this threat. That 5 meter threat to me is democracy and the health of our democracy. And so while there may be differences in how we feel in this what I call unnatural, uncomfortable alliance between the sane right, center, and the left, there may be differences in policy. None of that matters. It is a luxury when we can go back to disagreeing on issues and that being the most dramatic thing in our life, because right now we're literally fighting for the health of our democracy. So my message to the Democratic Party is be a big tent, right? Like welcome people like me into the Democratic Party, because you may not agree with everything I believe in. You probably agree with more than you think, but that's how you win. You don't win by saying we're not going to let anybody in here that thinks differently. That's how you lose elections.
There's a really smart question here that I'd love your thoughts on. If January 6th was not violent, and I know you anticipated it would be violent, you didn't typically bring your gun with you to the Capitol Hill, but you did that day. But if you had shown up and it turned out it wasn't that violent, maybe some people are protesting, but it didn't lead to an insurrection, what would have happened? Would you have left Congress? Would you have stood up? How would you have responded?
So that's a great question. I think I had pretty much made the decision to leave Congress anyway. So Arthur Brooks is a friend of mine. If any of you guys have heard of American Enterprise Institute, it's kind of a conservative think tank, but not like bad conservative. They're actually good. He once told me, he goes, you can do a job really well for 10 years, and after that, you can't. And, he's like, so that's why he left after he was the CEO of AEI in 10 years. He's like, I'm gone. And I thought about that in Congress, and I'm like, it kind of feels the same way. After 10 years, you kind of lose a little bit of the passion unless something sparks that passion back. January 6th is the thing that sparked that back in the defense of democracy. But I don't think I would have run again. I had considered actually not running again the cycle before. I'm glad I did, because it allowed me to be there for the fight. But the other thing is, regardless of the violence, I could not just be somebody that conforms to Trump. I mean, from the night of the election on, I was calling him out every day. Like, this is wrong, this is wrong. And I don't think I could have allowed myself to do that.
I've heard you talk, recently, well, for a while now, about the importance of Ukraine. You're very passionate about the importance of defending Ukraine. Why does that issue of all things animate you so much? And what do you think is going to happen under this administration?
Look, the reason it animates me so much is, it's like what I talked about a little in the opening remarks, which is like the thing, like we as Americans, and I'll say collectively, we as the West, I mean, right now we have like kind of the moral high ground in the world. We get to write the rules of trade. We write the rules of what is and what isn't human rights. The US dollar is the world's reserve currency. This is all really good stuff, right? Stuff that we as Americans should be proud of and defending. And I've always said, like, I traveled a lot in Congress. Obviously, I traveled a lot with the military. And I just saw when I would go places, being from the United States of America in a poor country where we have been using USAID, which nobody knew what it was until about a week ago. But to make people's lives better, I see the difference we make in people's lives, and I see their appreciation. I mean, I won't go into this story because it'll take too long, but basically I was in Kenya and in a little village, and this family showing me how the USAID sent a kid from the University of Illinois to teach them how to care for their cows. And now their cows went from making 2 pints of milk a day to 15 pints of milk a day, or whatever cows make. And they have enough for their kids, and they have extra. They can take it to the co-op that the U.S. built and make extra money, and we change their life. And I see stories like that, and I'm like, holy cow, that's amazing. And I see people like Ukraine fighting for their country, dying. And really, ladies and gentlemen, kicking Russia's ass. They are absolutely beating Russia. And I see that. And to me, it's just like we can play such an important role in changing the future of that country and people. That's why I'm so passionate about it. And, what happens under this administration, look, I don't know. I'll say this. So, Russia's lost close to 850,000 people killed, wounded, or missing. That's twice what the U.S. lost in the entire World War II, I believe. And Russia has gained almost no land for twice the casualties of the U.S. in World War II. Now, the fact that there are people out there saying Russia is winning is nuts. For a defending country to win, all they have to do is defend, right? If you're defending your country successfully, you're winning, especially after 3 years. And I feel like we are within 5 to 6, 7 months of Russia falling apart, honestly. And, intel reports I'm getting, like from the battlefield, are like the Russian military has culminated. They have no more offensive combat power. And yet we're about to throw Putin a lifeline. And that, to me, is the biggest concern. So what happens? I think if Donald Trump has his way, that's exactly what happens. We force Ukraine to take a bad deal. Russia is saved, and we lift sanctions, and they're back to normal. My hope is Canada and Europe make a decision that regardless of what the United States does, they're going to continue to allow Ukraine to defend itself. And I think Ukraine will collapse the Russians if they do that.
There are a couple of questions here about Gaza. I mean, you and I both spent a lot of time in Iraq and other places watching the challenge of occupation, U.S.-led occupation. In some cases, Canada is involved, as in Afghanistan. There is open talk in Washington, obviously by Trump and others, about marching into Gaza, taking it over, ethnically cleansing it. We saw a full-page ad today in the New York Times with major Jewish leaders saying, we don't support ethnic cleansing, don't do this for us, we're against this. Where do you think this is coming from? And, I mean, we used to think everything Donald Trump said was absurd and he's never going to do it. And that's kind of what was the first term. The second term, he's been doing what he's saying. Mm-hmm. I mean, He hasn't taken over Canada yet, but I mean, he's carrying out on some of the things he's saying that seem pretty outlandish. Is there a scenario in which this could actually happen? U.S. troops in Gaza taking it over and resorts on the coast?
I don't think so, because, I mean, even Rand Paul opposes this, because he's like, and I can't stand Rand. No, I mean, look, Donald Trump is an isolationist, but yet somehow he wants to invade Denmark, Canada, Panama, and maybe Mexico. He wants to start a war with Mexico, and then Gaza. So no, I don't think it happens. The problem is it doesn't matter if it happens or not. He's basically speaking on behalf of the United States about our values. Now look, the Israel-Gaza thing is a really, really difficult, right, tough thing. And, you know, it's as we've seen over the last year or so, like, it is a tinderbox. It's a tinderbox at home. It's a tinderbox there. And we need to walk a delicate line. This is not walking a delicate line. And this is very clearly, I mean, there's no doubt what he's talking about is, by definition, ethnic cleansing. I mean, it's just what it is. You know, you can be all for Israel's right to defend itself in Gaza, but even that, you're like, yeah, but we don't need to ethnically cleanse Gaza. And I just think it's insanity. What's behind it? Look, I mean, Netanyahu's come out and said it's a great idea. I don't know if it came from that or if it's truly that Donald Trump doesn't give a rat's ass about anybody but himself, and he's thinking about a Trump hotel there. And honestly, guys, I'm serious. I think Trump has lost his mind. Like, I don't say that like he has. Like, he's unmoored.
So, given that, I mean, if he is, you know, if he has lost his mind, but people are listening to him, you alluded to it earlier. There's a really smart question here about it. If we get to the point where because we've seen the courts pushing back on on all sorts of things. Courts are saying, hold it, you can't just go do that. They're doing what they're supposed to be doing. Many of them are Republican judges. I mean, they're reasonable, you know, judiciaries doing what they were designed to do. If it comes to the point where he's like, I don't want to listen to those guys, we're just going to do whatever we want. He controls the military, he could do it, right? He could ultimately ignore the courts.
Yep.
What is the recourse there?
So here's the good news, which is, I just saw, again, before walking out here, 83% of Americans believe that the president should not and cannot, in essence, overrule the Supreme Court. Why does 17% not believe that? I don't know, but 83% is a good number. So I truly believe if the president would decide, you know, ultimately he may ignore an appeals court or a circuit court or a federal, but if it comes to the Supreme Court, he'll do what the Supreme Court says. I believe that because there's going to be a lot of pressure to do it. Here's where my concern is they're not going to disobey the court on like, you know, although they're kind of doing it right now, I guess, on the spending freeze. But I think it's not going to be something that maybe most Americans would either not care about or whatever. They're going to disobey the court on an unpopular decision by the court, maybe by a little more of a progressive court that comes out with a decision. They're gonna void that, not follow it, and that's going to be the thing that crosses the Rubicon. And once you do it once, you can do it forever. So what's the recourse? There isn't one. I mean, sorry, there's literally no recourse except it was written in the Constitution, impeachment, right? You know, we know that's not going to happen.
Times, though, so
yeah,
it didn't make much of a difference.
It's not going to work. So that's the recourse. The other one is, again, take to the streets, protest. I mean, you know, Maidan, I guess, is like that's the only other recourse. And then make sure that the Democrats take the House in 2 years and that we crush this guy in 4. And look, you know, the reality is it feels like forever, and I was joking, not really, about like this 3 weeks feels like it's been forever. But in hindsight, when you look back historically, 4 years will go by pretty fast, and that'll be the key, is that we right the ship here.
There's an election coming up in this country. I don't know how much you followed the politics here, but there is a populist conservative leader who's emerging. A lot of Canadians, certainly progressive Canadians, are concerned about that. There have been comparisons made to Trump. I think they're, you know, a little pushing it because he's much smarter and he's not quite as unhinged. But but there are some you know, there are some overlaps. What advice do you have to progressive or moderate Canadians who are concerned that Canada might follow in some ways in the steps of the U.S.?
Well, the thing I would say is this: I would encourage you not to be overly, I don't want to say dramatic because that sounds mean, but like overly descriptive. If this guy, I don't know him obviously that well. If he's not a Trump, I think don't necessarily say he is, because I think what happens then is you lose the attention of people that may be more attracted to that. I think Trump is killing him, by the way, because like from what I hear, the tariff threats are not good for the conservatives here. And but so that would be the one thing I'd say. The other thing is this: is like, look, Canada or anywhere, you know, it is fairly likely that once you've had one kind of government for a while, that's gonna change. And so, you know, if you were a Trudeau fan, you were a liberal here, you may end up being in the opposition for the next however long. Just adjust to that, right? It's messaging, it's going out, it's winning that next election with people. And what do I hear? Like in Canada, a government lasts either 6 months or 10 years, something like that. And so I guess if that's you, just hope it lasts 6 months. I don't know. But yeah, that's the big thing I would say, is go out and compete on the field of ideas. Now, if this guy, and I haven't seen, and I don't think he is, but if you end up seeing illiberalism from people, you know, obviously speak up and yell. That's what I would say.
We as Americans, I think we're raised with this notion of American exceptionalism. You know, we're the best of this, best of that. The numbers don't bear that out, certainly today. Yeah. Certainly when it comes to social measures, whether it's, you know, health measures, quality of life, and even length of life. By so many measures, the U.S. is doing worse than many other countries, certainly worse than Canada on most levels. Is the U.S., in your opinion, in the decline? Is it moving towards a failed state? I mean, democracy is obviously being eroded at. Like, how do you characterize, you know, if you were a doctor and the U.S. was your patient, you know, is it sick? Does it need antibiotics? Does it need chemo? Like, what's going on here?
Yeah, I mean, I think probably chemo is the best way to talk, you know, like,
you got to kill the cancer.
I use the cancer analogy, right? Like, yeah, the body's been infected. It's sick. I think it's you know, it's obviously got some difficulties, but it's not hopeless. You know, and it's funny because it's like, is America in decline? You know, I think American democracy is being challenged, no kidding, obviously, but I also can look back at historical times when American democracy was also challenged. Economically, I mean, look, yeah, there's indicators like, obviously, wealth disparity. Part of the reason wealth disparity is so great is because we have uber rich people. You know, the poorest among us is still richer than many countries. You know, it's like, yeah, I wish we had better health care, but, you know, anybody that's homeless on the street can still go to an emergency room, and I'm not saying that that's health insurance. I'm just saying that, you know, the reality is that that's available. And so, yes, there's really some bad indicators, but our economy's pretty amazing in reality, right? We thought that by now China was going to surpass us as the largest economy in the world by 2020 or something like that. They're not even close. So if you look at other indicators, you can see that America is still, if we can get the democracy thing fixed and we can figure out how everybody in our society can have an equal share and an equal piece of that growing pie, I think the 21st century can be an American century. Or I'll share that with you guys. Let's call it a North American century. And but we do have to fix this democracy thing to get there. And I think if we do, which I am honestly fairly optimistic about, then I do think we can look back in 2050 and be like, America's still a great country to be part of. I mean, because we've been through this before. We get through it again.
You're a lieutenant colonel in the Air Force. You know a lot of people in the military. We've seen a lot of people in the military in the U.S., at least publicly, I don't know if it's privately, supporting Donald Trump. Mm-hmm. Now you have Pete Hegseth heading up the Department of Defense, who's obviously very much in line with Trump. You know, you talked about if Trump ignores the courts, people should march in the streets. Well, let's play this out. Yep. You know how this plays out. You know, Posse Comitatus putting aside, I mean, the military goes on the street and, you know, Kent State times 10,000. What's to stop Trump ordering the military to ultimately turn on the American people?
And this is a scary question because, again, it's he's the commander-in-chief. Let's say he gives an order, And it probably wouldn't be federal forces. He'd probably federalize National Guard forces that have more leverage. And let's say it's not even shooting everybody, but let's say it's putting down, First Amendment speech. Look, here's what it ultimately comes down to. Technically, well, it's not technically, it's true. When I swear into the military or I, get promoted, I swear an allegiance to the Constitution. And nowhere in there do I mention the president, nowhere in there do I mention the government. So by normal standards, you'd say, okay, you're violating the Constitution by turning on the American people, therefore you can't do it. And I think generally that holds. But the thing that concerns me is whose Constitution, right? Like one man's constitutional is another man's not constitutional. So all of a sudden, we say, gosh, you can't do this. It's against the Constitution. And Trump comes out and says, no, it's not. The Constitution says you can. Now, ultimately, it comes down to each person or each commander's decision. And, look, if you're a mid-ranking commander, are you really going to disobey the commander-in-chief? Especially if your generals are telling you to do it and everything. Because if you do, you're going to go to prison, and there's a captain that's happy to be a major tomorrow, So that is what I do worry about. Now, I'm not in the doomsday thing yet to think that's going to happen, but I think we need to entertain the reality of that, because one thing I've learned in the last few weeks is we cannot no longer afford to be surprised. We have to be prepared.
You have at least one thing in common with Hunter Biden.
Cool.
You've both been pardoned by his dad.
We do have that.
You didn't want to be pardoned, but you were. I'd love to just know, because you didn't really talk about this, but I have heard you talk about it in the past, what everything that you've done, all the outspokenness you've had, how has it impacted your life? Wow. I know relatives of yours have called you a member of the Devil's Army. You must be under threat. I see social media attacks on you. How, both because obviously we like you and care about you, but also just understanding the part of the country that turns on people who go against Trump. What is that like to feel the weight of that, the heat of that?
So look, I'll start with the good thing, which is in all my time in public service, I have never once, maybe that changes tonight, I've never once had anybody confront me and yell at me in public. Can you believe that? Isn't that surprising? Never once. Maybe I'm intimidating? I don't know. But I've never, God's honest truth, had any. Now, I guess I've had a couple people that'll try to take a film and try to engage you. But I've never had anybody come up and be like, F you, nothing like that. Which to me just says that, A, people are weak, scared, but also that still in person people can be decent, right? And the internet is not a fair reflection of that. What's it been like? It's been pretty tough. Let me just be honest with you now. I may have been honest the whole night, I think, but I'll be extra honest. Look, I think people, more than they fear death, they fear being kicked out of a tribe. I think 5 out of 10 people, adults, 8 out of 10 maybe, would step in front of a train to save a kid at the cost of their own life. I really believe most people would do that. But when you're asked to be kicked out of your tribe and isolated, that's hard. We're tribal people. We feel like we need to belong, right? We have to belong. That's in our DNA. And so when you make a decision to turn against your party, all of a sudden your entire social circle, and so now what I'm describing is what's happened to me. Your entire social circle that was built around your job, we all, whether we love it or not, generally our social circle kind of revolves around our job, especially when you have such an all-consuming job like Congress. Now all of a sudden, you're going to lose all of those friends and relationships. Now there's many that don't, but generically you lose all of them. I had my co-pilot from Iraq. This is a relationship that's supposed to be basically holy. I had my co-pilot from Iraq send me a message that he was ashamed to have ever flown with me, right? Why? Because he doesn't like what I'm doing politically. Okay, jerk, right? Like, you know, I've had family members, you alluded to it, my extended family, so my dad's cousins, sent me a certified letter in the mail, which I guess they still do, that said I was a member of the devil's army, I'm working on behalf of Satan, you know, that kind of stuff. And the problem is like over the years, it's just those little things that hit. And I thought, you know, if you'd have asked me at the end of Congress, how are you doing? I'm like, fine, don't care, screw these people. But I realized over like the last couple of years, the impact it really took on me. Look, you know, going out, I live in Texas now, which is pretty GOP centric. And, you know, everybody's nice there where I live. But like, you know, you feel a little isolated because you're aware that I'm going out in an area where these people probably either didn't like me or voted against me. And you realize the impact that takes is a while, and it takes some effort to work through it. And I would be lying if I told you I'm good now. We're all the way through it, but it does take an impact. And, you know, having a threat, you know, against my kid, like I hope your son wanders into traffic and is killed. You know, I hope somebody kills your wife. I hope somebody lines you up on a wall and takes care of your traitorous asses. Like, you can only listen to that for so long before it impacts your view on humanity, and that's what I try to fight against, is cynicism, because I don't want to be cynical. I want to believe the best in people, and I want to continue to fight for a good cause.
Well, you're always welcome up here. So.
Thanks. Like I said, I may be up here for asylum, so if anybody owns a McDonald's, I may come and get a job.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, guys. I appreciate it. Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thanks so much. Thanks, guys. Thank you. Have a good one.